Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Jones, and we're continuing on our Loft Teaching Artist Spotlight series. Today, we've got Christine joining us, and she's going to be teaching a voice and story and fiction class coming up. And Christine, I'm wondering if we can just start by introducing yourself to the audience and telling them a little bit about your upcoming class.
Sure. So I'm a freelance writer and a social psychologist. So by day, I teach psychology to undergraduates at San Jose State University. And when I'm not working on that, I write short stories mostly. So I've written a lot of literary fiction in different literary magazines, and my class is really focused on, I think, the two central elements of any story, which is voice and plot, right, or voice in the story part. And so it's a pretty long class, it's stretched over 12 weeks. And so we spend the first half focusing on how to refine and develop your own distinctive literary voice, your literary fingerprint, so to speak. And then we spend the second half talking about all the ways you can infuse plot into a story. So talking specifically about, literary plot devices, tension, and different ways in which you can sort of follow the arc of a narrative to make it feel like it's moving forward. And even though I write a lot of short stories myself, I'm also working on a novel. So for the class, we work on both, right? So the last time I taught it, most of my students were working on novels themselves, and I think I had one student working on short stories. And so depending on what you're working on, you can sort of tailor the material to your own work. So if you're working on a short story, obviously it's a little easier to change your voice per short story. If you're working on something like a novel, then you have a much bigger sort of challenge in front of you of maintaining a consistent voice, and sort of focusing maybe more on plot than you would in the context of at least a literary short story.
Mhm.
So that's my class in a nutshell.
And one of the things I think that people often struggle with is they usually come sort of with a background that's like they either have a really good foundation in sort of like that story arc and plot building, or they have a really good idea about the voice and the inner life and the
Yeah,
character of
yeah,
that's driving the story. But finding the balance between those two things is often one of the bigger challenges there is in fiction. And I'm wondering how like I love the way that you're breaking down this class into sort of like a first section and a second section. How do those things come together, and how do people sort of balance them out?
yeah. That's a great question, and that's something I struggle with a lot myself, especially in like the novel aspect. I think with a short story, there's less space to be challenged by both plot and voice. But I think in the course of a novel, certainly you have that tension, right? And some people, I think there's different opinions on this. I've heard before that like characterization is plot,
Hmm.
at least if you're a literary person or you like literary fiction. So I
Hmm.
think, especially when I read literary fiction, even really good literary fiction, I find that usually the focus is much more on like character development and the motivation and the inner lives. And literary fiction gets away with this. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I think there's lots of really great books written with not too much plot going on, but with characters that you really invest in and you're fascinated by. Right. And so I think actually how you deal with that tension depends on the genre you're aiming for. Right. So if you're a literary person and you're going to ultimately submit your material to literary folks, I think you don't actually, I mean, I think you still want enough plot to move the narrative forward, but I think that there's probably slightly less concern over like the amount of tension and the arc of the story. But I think if you're aiming for anything that's like upmarket, commercial, or women's fiction or genre fiction, even, I think you definitely, I think in those cases, voice definitely helps and makes you stand out. But I think I would say that the vast majority of your attention should be spent on that storyline and that
Hmm.
page turning aspect.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it ultimately depends on what kind of writer the person wants to become, right? Like, do they want to, be the next blank and whatever they fill in the blank with,
Right, right.
just makes sense, right?
So, and actually, let's talk about kind of characterization and voice. I think one of the things that I'd be really excited to take this class from you is that you have this sort of background and perspective coming from, you've studied and taught and learned, the psychology world about sort of like human dynamics, human motivations, those kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how that background informs your approach to fiction, and how you think that can be helpful to other writers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimately the goal of almost any storyteller or writer is to like really get into the heads of their characters, right? To really embody their characters in a way where they feel like they know them as well as they know themselves. And I think that's the same goal of psychology, right? As a psychologist, I'm trying to literally read the minds of people I'm studying, right? I'm trying to get in them and figure out their motivations and the causes of their behavior. And I think in that sense, writers and psychologists want the same thing. They want to unpack and figure out why people do the things they do. And at least for me in particular, the things I study in psychology are the things I have the hardest time understanding. And for better or worse, it's the same things that I write about. So, in my class, we talk a lot about this question of whether you should write what you know. And I think there's both truth in that, and I think there's limitations if that's all you ever do, right? So I think part of the challenge is also writing what you don't know, right? Asking the questions of like, what are things that I don't fully understand, and how can I make a really interesting character based on these tensions of what I can't figure out about their behavior, right? And I think one of the things that maybe psychology has taught me is to do research before I try to answer any questions. So, in my academic life, research is like a huge half of what I do, right? Other than teaching, I do research. And the research I tackle in my academic circles or have to do with culture and emotions and close relationships. And I think those are the very same questions I tackle in my short stories in my novel. And so I think looking into sort of the reasons behind people's behavior and even doing research into characters that I may not fully understand, right? Doing research into like settings and timelines, and even like perspective. Sometimes I'll read articles written by people I strongly disagree with because I really want to figure out like what's going on inside their head. Like what are they trying to do? And I think everyone has a motivation. Like everything can be explained. Even serial killers and dictators probably have very compelling stories that explain how they got to the point they are. And I think the goal of both psychology and writing is to figure out what those stories are.
I love that. I love that so much. So, and ultimately, kind of what are some of your hopes or goals for students who take your course? Like, what do you hope they leave the course with?
I think one of the biggest goals is that they leave their course with either new material or strongly revised like existing material, right? So I think the goal of my course is to make the course as useful and as tailored to whatever goal the person is already working on. So I think sometimes I have students who don't have a work in progress and they want inspiration. So I think in every one of my classes we always have like a writing exercise at the end, followed by sort of like a workshop style sharing and feedback session. And so I think part of the goal is if you like writing but you don't have something you're working on, part of the goal is to inspire you to write something based on the prompts that I give, right? But for other people who already have, so I have students come in last semester with entire novels that they've worked on for years and years. and I think in those cases my goal is to help them figure out what they need to revise and give them very like clear directional feedback on that revision process. Right. So I think depending on what you need, I have slightly different goals for the course. And hopefully that means everyone can get something out of it.
Great, great. Well, anything else that that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Well, I don't think so. I think you
Okay.
covered all the important bases.
Well, I'm really excited for the students who join in this class. It sounds like a really great one. Thanks for taking the time with us. This class starts January 26th, so if you're watching this, get registered quick.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christine. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Bye.